Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, everyone, whenever, wherever this may find you. I'm Bhuvan Apurva and you are with Argumentative Indians. Recently, several human rights organizations, including B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, have concluded that Israel's governance of Palestinians and occupied Palestinian territory amounts to the crime of apartheid under international law. Now, the term apartheid is an emotive one and is mainly associated with the dark days of South Africa. But this should not necessarily be the point of reference when it comes to Israel. The 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court characterizes apartheid as an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. It is against this test that relations between Israel and the Palestinians will be tested in the special live discussion on Argumentative Indians. Israel has been accused of considering the Palestinians as a demographic threat and imposing measures to control and decrease their presence and access to land in Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. Critics say that these demographic aims are well illustrated by official plans to Judaize areas of Israel and West Bank, including East Jerusalem, which continue to put thousands of Palestinians at risk of forcible transfer. Israel also stands accused of running a campaign of oppression without borders and treating the Palestinians as lesser citizens through codified laws and statutes. Now, Israel and her partner allies have vehemently refuted these allegations. Israel is claimed as a multiracial and multicolored society, and that the Arab minority actively participate in the political process. Evidence is also pointed to the fact that incitement to racism in Israel is a criminal offense, as is discrimination on the basis of race or religion. Defenders of Israel also point out to the fact that there isn't a single Jewish community living anywhere under Palestinian control. Now, this obviously isn't because of some Jewish preference. Jewish communities exist worldwide. They would certainly exist 10 minutes from Jerusalem if it not were for the Palestinian Authority's policies of excluding Jews and inciting violence and prejudice against them. Palestinian law makes selling land to Jews a crime punishable by death, often without trial. Nor does the authority recognize any Jewish titles to private property. In Israel, by contrast, Arabs enjoy full property rights enforced by the courts. So, where does the truth lie? Are the detractors of Israel wrongly conflating the Jewish movement for self-determination with the white supremacist South African regime, or is there some truth to those very grave accusations? To dissect the different facets of the question, is Israel committing apartheid against Palestinians? We are joined by an eminent set of panelists on Argumentative Indians this evening. Please join me in welcoming Itamar Marcus, researcher and the founder and director of Palestinian Media Watch; Abhijit Iyer Mitro, senior fellow at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies; and Akshaya Kumar, crisis advocacy director at Human Rights Watch and professor at Columbia University. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us here at Argumentative Indians in this special live discussion. Ms. Akshaya Kumar, I'd like to begin with you. Human Rights Watch has been working on human rights in Israel for many countless years. Tell our viewers about what has brought you to this point where we are using a charged word such as apartheid to describe the Israeli government and administration.
Thank you for creating this platform and giving us the time to speak and address our work. As you mentioned, Human Rights Watch, we are an international organization. We have a mandate that covers the world. And in fact, we do research on over 90 countries, which includes the situation in Israel and Palestine. And our mandate is drawn from international law. And so, as you rightly noted, the term apartheid, as I interpret it as an international lawyer, is one that's defined in the Rome Statute. It's defined in the Convention on the Prevention and Suppression of Apartheid, and it's one that's defined under customary international law. So it's less of a comparison, or as you said, an emotive term, and more of an assessment, looking at things as it is. And our sense at Human Rights Watch were that other legal descriptions don't fully capture the fundamental nature of what's happening between Israel and Palestine. The fact that we have one primary sovereign, the Israeli government, that for more than half a century now has exercised control over an area between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. This is an area where two groups of people live, and that sovereign government methodologically privileges one group, which is Jewish Israelis, and represses the other group, which is Arab Palestinians, with varying degrees of intensity across that area. We've heard, there's some sort of pieces of conventional wisdom. One, for example, that this occupation that we see in the West Bank is temporary, that there's been a withdrawal from Gaza. But the fact is that Palestinians have little meaningful control over their affairs, with Israeli exclusive control over the majority of these areas. And the fact that freedom of movement is restricted, borders are restricted, population is restricted, airspace is restricted. Finally, this notion that there will be a peace process that will soon end these abuses, I think it allows people to ignore the fact that we have a crime, a serious crime under international law, one for which individuals can be identified and prosecuted. And so in light of these dynamics, as a human rights organization, we've been focusing more and more on the issue of institutional discrimination. And there's a universal prohibition that's recognized around the world. In fact, at Human Rights Watch, we first did work on apartheid in the context of the Rohingyas treatment in Myanmar, where we found that, again, the act, the context, and the intent were met, that there are grave abuses that are inhumane acts, there's systematic oppression of one group over another, and there's this intent to dominate. Over a year ago now, actually a year and a half back, we issued over 200-page legal analysis that made the same determination about Israeli authorities' commission of this crime against millions of Palestinians in areas under its control. We also found that Israeli authorities were committing the crime of persecution. And we see that the elements of these crimes are coming together in the occupied territories, particularly the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but that the intent to dominate is seen in Israeli government policy, which, as you mentioned, we can see clear evidence of an interest in maintaining demographic control over this area. And two of the clearest indicia, and I'll just spotlight these, are the nation-state law, which affirms that Israel is a nation state of Jewish people and declares that within that territory, the right to self-determination is unique also to the Jewish people, and it establishes Jewish settlement as a national priority. So they're not hiding the intent here. It's written right into the nation-state law passed in 2018. There's also an example then, if you were to see, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon back in 2005 saying there's no need to hide behind security arguments. There is just a need for the Jewish state. And we've had Netanyahu who said that we should make the process more difficult for Palestinians who want to get citizenship in order to guarantee Israel's security and a Jewish majority in Israel. So clear intent, not hidden, openly expressed by senior government officials. We see laws, planning documents that make it clear again that Israeli authorities going back for decades, have been pursuing a policy of separation, a policy of control, and a policy to settle the land around Arab minority population centers to maintain solid Jewish majority. And they even have target demographic ratios that have been written into laws and policies. Many people, and I'll end on this point, refer to security justification. Some policies don't have security justification that would be justified under public international law. So denying systematically building permits. One of the issues that you brought up in your introduction, you talked about restrictions on land ownership. And there was a claim there from Israeli supporters that Arabs have the right to own land across the country in Israel, that this is protected constitutionally. But actually in many towns within Israel, there are local rules which prohibit the buying of prospective residents based on their asserted incompatibility with the town's sociocultural fabric. And according to a study by a professor, an Israeli professor based in Haifa, there are more than 900 small Jewish towns across Israel that restrict who lives there. So this issue of restriction, of demographic control, of Judaizing, the Negev and the Galilee, these are policy objectives that are divorced from any kind of security concern. And of course, a crime against humanity like the crime of apartheid can't be wished away by just appealing to a very general notion of a security concern. You really have to look at each act and see if it meets the tests and thresholds of international law. And so it's for those reasons that we think it's very important that not just lawyers engage in this debate, but average people come to terms with the fact that here in 2022, we do have a government, that prides itself as being democratic, that is engaging in a serious international crime. And as Indians, as people who prize democracy as well, I think it's important to engage with that reality and not ignore it.
Thank you, Ms. Kumar. Let me bring in Mr. Itamar Marcus. Mr. Marcus, you have had a long reputation in Israel of talking on Israel-Palestinian issue on a large scale. Can we have you respond to Ms. Kumar when she says that Israel is the intent of Israel when she talks about it? How would you respond to Ms. Kumar regarding those statements?
Okay, so first of all, there were numerous incorrect statements, false statements that she listed, and I can't go through all of them because it'd be impossible. So I just want to give an overview, and then I will focus on a couple of the things that she said that were completely false. So first of all, to refer to Israel as apartheid is so, even asking the question, Israel is a sea of democracy and human rights and equality for its citizens in an island, in a Middle East island of racism, anti-Semitism, dictatorships. Israel is the sea, the only bright light in the entire region. And to come and say that Israel is the problem is, first of all, outrageous. Even asking the question is completely outrageous. Within Israel itself, you just have to look at the positions of power and positions of importance held by Arabs and held by Muslims to completely erase this whole claim of apartheid. So, for example, you have Khalid Kaboub today, a Supreme Court justice on the Israeli Supreme Court. You've heard, and in the past, you've had other Supreme Court justices. You have a minister in the Israeli government today, Issawah Frej. How could that be apartheid? We have an entire Arab party as part of the coalition, the party of Ram, headed by Mansour Abbas. Get this one. The chairman of Bank Leumi, which is the Israel National Bank, is Dr. Samir Yihya Haji Yihya, an Arab. The chairman of the Israel National Bank is an Arab. COVID, the crisis that the world's been facing, who is Israel's COVID czar? The COVID czar is Salman Zarqa, an Arab. The head of Rambam Hospital's response team is an Arab. Israel's even had affirmative action laws in universities to increase Arab representation to make up for the past when they were not as they weren't getting as good an education. So now it's easier for them to get into many universities, including into medical schools. And by the way, even in the social realm, just a few years ago, Rana Raslan, an Israeli Arab, was chosen to be Miss Israel in the national beauty pageant. So across the entire range of Israeli life, from social to political to legal. You have Arabs who are playing a major role. By the way, for this reason, when when Israeli Arabs were asked in a recent poll, how do they feel about being Israeli Arabs? Over 50% said they were proud to be Israeli Arabs. That would never happen in an apartheid regime, to be proud of being. And more than that, we studied the election results in 2019. Over 25% of Israeli Arabs actually voted for Zionist parties. None of this makes sense with the word apartheid. Now, where is there apartheid? Where is there oppression? And why are the Arabs of the West Bank frustrated? And I'll tell you why. Because many years ago, not so many years ago, 1994, the Palestinian Authority was established. And this was going to give rule for the Palestinian population, self-rule. They were going to have elections. They were supposed to be a democracy. Well, you know, the last time they had elections was over 16 years ago. Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority, refuses to give them elections. Refuses. Now, why does he refuse? And this has been documented, and this has been actually confirmed in polls of Palestinians. He refuses because he knows that Hamas is going to win the elections. He knows he will lose for the presidency. Just last year, under American pressure, the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, scheduled elections for June 23rd, May 23rd. What happened? 3 weeks before then, he suddenly canceled the elections. Palestinians and Poles said he canceled the elections because he knew they were going to lose. Palestinians are frustrated and don't have rights, not because of Israel. They're all living under the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. There is no occupation of the Palestinians, 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. They're not under occupation. They're living under the Palestinian Authority. It's a cruel dictatorship of Palestinians by Palestinian leaders that's causing their suffering. And what's happening here? The Palestinian Authority and people like Human Rights Watch are then coming to the world and say, oh, Palestinians are suffering because of Israel. Well, and they tell the Palestinians you're suffering because of Israel. And tragically, some of the Palestinians buy that line. They buy that line and they instead of directing their hatred against their real oppressors, the Palestinian Authority, they go and they direct their hatred toward Israel. So it's a typical case of a human rights abuser getting the people angry, abusing, and then blaming someone else for those human rights abuses. The final thing I want to say by way of introduction is about Human Rights Watch. We heard about this report from Human Rights Watch. Do you know who was the most important critic ever of Human Rights Watch? Ever? Robert Bernstein. Robert Bernstein was the founder of Human Rights Watch. He founded Helsinki Watch. He turned it into Human Rights Watch. He was the chairman of the board for dozens of years. And at a certain point, when he saw how prejudiced they were against Israel, how prejudiced they were against the Jews of Israel, he distanced from them. He wrote an op-ed in the New York Times criticizing them. Eventually, he left their board. So when you have the chairman and founder of Human Rights Watch saying that they're biased and they're prejudiced, you know why you're getting reports like the one we heard described just now. It has nothing to do with objectivity. It has to do with the fact that this is a prejudiced anti-Israel organization, and they will do whatever they can to distract the anger of Palestinians in the world from the Palestinian leadership, who everyone should be angry about, and redirect it toward Israel falsely.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Itamar Marcus. Let me move on to Mr. Abhijit Iyer Mitra. Thank you for joining us here at Argumentative Indians. In May last year, Abhijit, you had tweeted out, if you are classifying Israel as apartheid, you are by definition not an academic. Could you tell us, our viewers, what was the thinking behind that statement, and what evidences are you taking into consideration to that end?
Sure. So generally what we realize is, first, let's be clear, no country here is claiming to be the Virgin Mary. Okay, nobody is without stain or whatever. That said, it's very easy to manipulate facts on emotion, to turn things around and make it emotional. First, let's look at three things that got conflated in the previous conversations. The first is Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. We need to remember Israel, as in the borders of Israel and Israeli citizens, they all have equal rights. Okay, the Druze, the Arabs, the Jews, right? They have their own personal laws, which is the same as in Lebanon, where the religious body, and this is a British inheritance really, where they govern their own personal religious laws. The second is the issue of citizenship rules. And this was something that was conflated by Human Rights Watch, which is, if Palestinians demand citizenship, they should be given it. That's not how it works. Okay. Now, you have states based on you have ideological states, you have linguistic states, you have religious states. And the UN recognizes every one of those states' right to exist and function to their own unique genius. So, for example, for America, it's, the American dream, that you come from wherever and you make it big, you become a capitalist, and et cetera, et cetera. With France and Germany, mostly because of Westphalia and the 30 Years' War, you end up being linguistic states, where, in order to become a citizen, you have to pass linguistic exams and things like that. You have a third category, which is religious states. Israel was formed as a religious, it was a state for Jews, all right, especially after what happened with the Holocaust. So you have absolute freedom to give citizenship or not give citizenship to who you want, based on your founding ideology, your founding myth, your foundational idea, or whatever it is. Number one. Number two, it's not just based on, I want to become a citizen. I think I'm a really nice guy and I want to become a Swiss citizen. There is no obligation for them to give me Swiss citizenship. Okay, so citizenship just can't be given as and when you want it. I have to tell you that every time we've been in three, quasi-official delegations, both to the West Bank and to Gaza. And every time we've had these off the record, not off the record, but, well, they're not televised, conversations with, say, Hanan Ashrawi or Hussam Zomlot or Sai Barakat or Nabil Shat, the standard thing we get is, wait, we're going to overtake their population and soon we'll be the majority. And then we will decide what to do. So, if you hear the Israelis and Netanyahu saying, oh, this has to be maintained, sadly, whether you like it or not, that is a recognized framework for maintaining a certain national character. On the other hand, it's not that the Palestinians don't say the exact same thing on growing their population, leadership statements to that effect. So this is point number two. The third is the fact that we have to deal with the fact that Palestine is under occupation. Okay, occupied territories by their very nature are not eligible for citizenship. Now, we also have to remember that as long as Israel's security concerns were met, Israel has been happy to lift the occupation and lift the occupation very rapidly. So if you remember, the entire Sinai was under Israeli occupation after the 73 war. And Sinai was what? It was about 2-3 times the size of Israel today. And it was given back to Egypt in its entirety, except the Gaza Strip, which Egypt did not want back. Then, when they negotiated the accords and everything like that, it was, the ultra hawk, Ariel Sharon, who supervised the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip completely. And if you remember, there were old settlements out there which were completely dismantled. We've seen those videos of Israeli soldiers carrying out Jewish settlers, pulling them by the hair and taking them out, because all the settlements were meant to be finished. Now, Israel has a very clear criteria out here. You have to guarantee security, and it comes with a timeout, and that's a negotiating tactic. Okay, that's perfectly permissible. Okay, now you can't go around having suicide bombings. Do you remember what happened with Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin? There were bombs going off in buses every single day. 60 people killed, 50 people killed, 70 people killed, etc., etc., etc. They have a right of self-defense whether you like it or not. Okay, so these were three main things. An occupied territory functions differently. Israel has shown its willingness to lift an occupation as long as its security concerns are met. If you look at the Gaza withdrawal, it has happened. There is the issue of citizenship laws, which is a completely different ballgame. We should not conflate that. And then there is the issue of Israeli Arabs and Israel proper, which is the third issue, which we should not be conflating in all of this. And therein lies the problem. It is the deliberate conflation of all these different things where you then come up with this thing that, well, Israel is an apartheid state. I've been to Israel and to Palestine some 16, 17 times now. And I keep getting, talking points from both sides, but I'm yet to see any proper evidence of apartheid as we know it. I've also been to South Africa when it was apartheid. Just after apartheid, otherwise I probably wouldn't have been allowed to go in. That was a completely different thing. I think people who compare one with another have actually never been to apartheid South Africa or know what they're talking about on the ground out here.
Right. Thank you, Abhijit. Let me move on to Ms. Akshaya Kumar. Ms. Akshaya Kumar, can we have you respond to Mr. Itamar Marcus when he says that the onus lies on the Palestinian Authority and not on the Israelis, and it's them who are the oppressors? How does that reconcile with your report?
Well, our report finds that substantially, given the kinds of control that Israeli authorities are exercising over the population and the territory, Mr. Marcus's assertion that there's no occupation, it just doesn't hold up under the terms of international law. The United Nations agreed and continues to agree that the characterization that's appropriate for these territories is those under occupation. So, it doesn't matter if Mr. Marcus or someone else says, oh, we're not occupying anymore. If they continue to fulfill the elements of control required to meet the legal standard, then they are indeed occupiers. And I think we need to move the conversation, especially because we lack a Palestinian here, to the human impact of what we're talking about. It's easy for, someone like Abhijit to say, well, every state has a right to treat people differently and offer different kinds of citizenship based on different criteria. But the fact is that Israeli rules around particularly the question of permits and residency result in the separation of families. It results in the fact that, for example, let me give you a case of a 24-year-old Anas and a 22-year-old Nuzah who fell in love. They got married, but there was one problem. Nuzah was from the West Bank, Anas was from East Jerusalem. As a result, Nuzah, because of her age, she's under 25, is completely ineligible to even get a permit to live in East Jerusalem. The couple had 2 children, including an 18-month-old, and this isn't a law that goes unenforced. In fact, B'Tselem reported on this just a few weeks back. On Wednesday, June 29th, around 10 p.m., the couple were driving with their 2 daughters, a 1-month-old and an 18-month-old, to a pastry shop in East Jerusalem. Police officers stopped them. They demanded to see their permits. When they discovered that Nuzah only has a permit for the West Bank, they told her she was under arrest, put her in a police car, and left the children while Anas was being interrogated. Nuzah then had to be picked up by her family. All of this is the result of what was enacted back in 2003 as a quote-unquote temporary order, extended every year since. But it reflects these efforts by the Israeli authorities and that intent to dominate. So we know that any Jewish person in the world, his children, grandchildren, their spouses, they're entitled to immigrate to Israel and get citizenship. Abhijit says, fine, this is their rule. They would like to have citizenship based on religion. But then we see that Palestinians are living in a different reality. Not only can they not immigrate to an area under Israeli control, if they're found, and come on, this is quite reminiscent of the past system, they have to show their document. If they don't show their document, they are stuck without status, and Palestinians then cannot formally work. They cannot move freely. They cannot renew their driver's licenses. They cannot obtain birth certificates. This might require and allow them to lose benefits under the National Insurance Program. And many residents of East Jerusalem then are at risk of losing their status because, the other option would be to spend more time in the West Bank. But then Israeli, as the occupying powers, have rejected applications for people to maintain their Jerusalem residency as well. So you see, this is just an example of one family, but we see the human impact of these laws and the way then you have the crime of apartheid. Another piece I really wanted to pick up on what Mr. Marcus said is this assertion that even having the conversation is beyond the pale. I think on a platform like Argumentative Indians, we know that being able to have open conversation about any issue is very important. Freedom of speech is very important. But what we're seeing increasingly, unfortunately, in Israel is a closing of any kind of free speech and discourse around these types of issues. And in fact, organizations that do this kind of work, that do documentation work, are smeared. They are labeled, tarred and feathered as terrorist organizations. In the case of 6 particular civil society organizations, close partners of ours, Israeli authorities have designated them as terrorist organizations in an effort to chill their free speech and to prevent them from securing any kind of funding, because people would be nervous about providing donations to nonprofits that are deemed terrorists. Meanwhile, the United Nations has looked at these allegations. Western governments, including the European Union, have looked at these allegations. A whole slew, about a dozen of European governments, have all come out and said, there's no evidence behind this. It's just a tactic to try to close the space, to say, well, there are some things we can't talk about. There's some groups that you can't hear from. And that's a really dangerous precedent. And it's one that you only get into, a dynamic that you only get into when you're afraid of what people are going to say, what kind of truths they're going to bring forward. So, this notion that there are some statements that are beyond the pale, that we can't even entertain the question about whether or not the crime of apartheid is taking place, I think that's deeply disturbing, the notion that there is some question that's beyond the pale, especially when you have this kind of rigorous legal assessment being done by the United Nations. The Special Rapporteur on the situation in the occupied territories, Michael Link, issued a report recently that found that he believes the legal threshold for the crime of apartheid is taking place. You've had reputable Israeli organizations, including Yesh Din, do their own legal analysis, Israeli lawyers who practiced before that Israeli Supreme Court. So creating the sense that we can't even talk about it, I would be really worried about allowing that to stand. And then the last point, this sort of ad hominem attack on my organization, Human Rights Watch, or the sense that, one of our founders differed with what the organization was doing, particularly on the situation in Israel. I would respectfully say, let's read it the other way. We have an organization that's principled, that takes a universal approach to all situations. We work on the situation of the Uyghur in China, identifying that as a crime against humanity. We work on the situation of Tigrayans in Ethiopia who are facing famine and mass starvation. We work on the situation of South Sudanese, of Darfuris, of Syrians, of Brazilians, indigenous in the Amazon. We're a global organization. And yes, it's true, one of our founders, who himself is very close to the Zionist cause, found that our work on Israel was uncomfortable for him. He distanced himself. He made his objections known. Unlike Mr. Marcus, we don't say someone can't speak, someone can't, even entertain a question. He was free to air his disagreements. And we've proceeded now for many decades, which our approach, which is an international one. We don't have any exceptionalism. For Israel, we don't give, that notion of an island in a sea. That doesn't change the standard that we assess based on, which is international law. We assess all countries in the same way, all governments, all authorities, and individuals when they commit crimes. We should be able to talk about them and name them.
Right. Let me bring in Mr. Marcus, and I'd like you to respond to what Ms. Akshay Kumar is saying, but also to the fact that for more than 50 years now, around only a quarter of the Palestinians who live in the disputed part of the world, who live between the river and the sea, as it said, whether in Israel proper or occupied territories, whose everyday lives are controlled by Israel almost for a decade now. Only a quarter of them have a say over which political party or prime minister controls their life. The vast majority of Palestinians don't get a say, they don't get a vote. There's a word for that, isn't there, Mr. Marcus?
Okay, so let me respond to a few things. First of all, I never said that we shouldn't discuss the the question of Israel apartheid. I said it's absurd to discuss the question of Israel apartheid, and that the organization we should be discussing, or the government we should be discussing, is the Palestinian Authority. And let me just give you some examples why this is completely on its head, that Israel's being discussed and not the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority literally preaches a genocidal anti-Semitism against Jews, which has not been documented by Human Rights Watch. And I'll just give you an example. Just a few weeks ago, on official Palestinian TV, which is owned and controlled by the Palestinian Authority, the religious figure prayed on TV, Allah exterminate the Jews. Allah exterminate the Jews. This isn't the first time. We've heard it so many times on Palestinian TV, calling for genocide, quoting a hadith from that talks about the resurrection will come until Muslims fight the Jews and kill them. We've heard that so many times on official Palestinian TV, literally calling for extermination of Jews. There was another religious figure on TV who recently, a few years ago, talked about Hitler's killing of the Jews was Allah's punishment of the Jews for their crimes. Now, who do you think it was who said on official Palestinian television, who said that the Jews suffered massacres all throughout history in Europe? Every 10, 15 years, he said the Jews suffered massacres leading all the way up until the Holocaust. So he acknowledged the massacres and the Holocaust. And then he said, but why did this happen? The Jews brought it on themselves because of their social role. Who said this? It was Mahmoud Abbas himself. Mahmoud Abbas, head of the Palestinian Authority, on TV saying Jews brought the massacres upon themselves because of their behavior through all these years. So this is the top of the Palestinian Authority. This is the entity that should be discussed for racism, discussed for human rights violations. This is the Palestinian Authority, and they do it openly, and it's all been documented by Palestinian Media Watch. You asked a comment about, you said, I wanted to talk about one of the comments that was said, that Israel's intent is to dominate the Palestinians. There is nothing farther from the truth. Just a few years after the signing of the Oslo Accords, there were peace talks between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat at the time. Americans were involved as well. Everyone admitted, everybody acknowledged that Israel wanted to create a Palestinian state, offered a Palestinian state, essentially on the borders that the Palestinians wanted. The Americans, everyone condemned the Palestinian Authority for not accepting the state, but they didn't want it. What did they do instead? And this is critical. Another comment by Ms. Kumar was that Israel exaggerates security concerns. But you know what happened in response to our offering statehood to Yasser Arafat? 2 months later, he launched what he called Intifada, which was a terror war. Suicide bombers being sent across from the Palestinian Authority. And it didn't happen in 2 months. They had been building up these armaments, building up these suicide bombs, building up these terror havens inside the Palestinian areas. And literally they were sending bombs. There were some days where we had 2 and 3 suicide bombings in one bus here. And literally what was happening was, and I remember this, we have young children at the time, and the children, they all had cell phones so that they could call us every time there was an announcement of another suicide bombing. Mom, Dad, I'm okay. The bomb went off, but I'm okay. Speak to you later. Because this is what was going on. It was that common. 1,200 Israelis were killed over the next few years, primarily suicide bombings, supported by the Palestinian Authority at the time. Now, and you have the nerve to say we take security concerns, we exaggerate security concerns. If not for the suicide bombings, by the way, before the Oslo Accords, there were no security boundaries. Literally, an Arab could drive, a Palestinian could drive from Gaza to the Golan Heights in northern Israel without meeting an Israeli soldier. It was these suicide bombings that the Palestinian Authority initiated, which forced Israel to create the security boundary. We never wanted. In fact, before the Oslo Accords, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were working in Israel, sleeping in Israel, speaking Hebrew. The economies were all intertwined. It was the terror that broke down all of this. It was Palestinian Authority terror that broke down all of this. So to come and say that Israel intended to control, we didn't intend. This was our response to offering statehood. A number of years later, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert negotiated with Mahmoud Abbas. and he offered him statehood as well. In fact, Saeb Arikat, who was the negotiator for the PLO, said on Palestinian television that Israel actually offered more land to the Palestinian Authority than Jordan had before the Six-Day War. That's how generous the offer was from Israel. And you know what? The Palestinians accepted again. So Israel has been begging the Palestinians to take control of their lives, and the Palestinians don't want to take control of their lives. The Palestinian Authority would rather continue as a terror organization, continue demonizing Israel around the world. They don't give us independence. The fact is they've been offered it, but they don't want it, because this is a much more, it's much easier. When you have a state, you have to worry about education, you have to worry about, all the things. They would much rather be a terror organization and continue fighting Israel. Now, you also made a comment about criticism of Israel having laws that allow Jews around the world to come to Israel and accept statehood. Now, first of all, you have to understand, the term Jew is from the term Judean. It's not a religious term. It's a national term. If you look at the Russian coin after the destruction of the temple, it says Judea Capta. It wasn't talking about a religion. It's talking about the Judean nation, the Jewish nation. The same way, if an Indian might have moved out of the country even a few generations ago, India could have laws and says every Indian who can trace their ancestry to an Indian can come back and accept citizenship. That's what this law is. It's every Jew around the world, descendants of the Jewish people or people who chose to adopt Judaism are part of the Jewish nation. It's not a religious categorization. They're part of the Jewish people the same way Indians can come back to India, Jews can come back to Israel. Now, Arabs who are in the country, as I described to you before, have completely equal rights. Now, why don't the Palestinians on the West Bank have voting rights in Israel? As I said before, Palestinians have voting rights in the Palestinian Authority, but those rights have been squashed by the Palestinian leaders. That's where they should have voting rights. You ask why they haven't had rights for 50 years. We've offered them. We gave them the Palestinian Authority, which could have transitioned into a state, but it certainly should be a democracy. Even today, it could be a democracy. Why isn't he giving them the right to vote? So what's happening is, again, Palestinians are suffering for a million different reasons. The source of their suffering, the source of their lack of statehood, the source of the lack of ability to vote, the source even of their anti-Semitism is the education of their leaders, like Mahmoud Abbas. The source of their hatred of Israel is the leadership's demonization of Jews, like we heard, like we hear regularly by the leadership. So this is the problem. The problem is not really, I work with a number of Palestinians, and I've met Palestinians, those who realize and recognize what's going on. They're horrified by their leadership. Those are the ones who eventually could bring peace, because they realize that in order to have peace, we first have to get rid of the real oppressors in the Middle East. That is the Palestinian Authority. They are the oppressors of the Palestinian people.
Right. I want to bring in Abhijit Iyer Mitra when we talk about Israeli intent, but let me quickly jump across to Ms. Akshay Kumar before that. Akshay, Mr. Itamar Marcus points about the reports being essentially anti-Semitic in nature. But when you look back in history, you have had former Israeli prime ministers, in fact, say that if Israel doesn't change, it risks becoming an apartheid state. How would you respond to Mr. Itamar Marcus then?
Right, and I mean, it's not just former Israeli prime ministers. We even have former members of the Israeli security services, 2 former attorney generals or deputy attorney generals, who have not just said, if things don't change, we might become an apartheid system, but said, look, I hate to admit it about my own country, but this is how things have changed. And I do think that the passage of time and how the Israeli authorities have adjusted their approach is quite relevant here, because these were people who were in government, and we've collected this list of, as I said, prominent Israeli parliamentarians, of 2 former deputy attorney generals, of somebody who used to work for the Shin Bet, who've all come to this reluctant truth, which is that the crime of apartheid is taking place. I think the fig leaf, the idea that there's a two-state solution, that there's this negotiation ongoing, we really need to scrutinize that. There haven't been real talks since 2014. We're talking about years and years and years where there haven't been real talks. So this assertion that we hear that, Mr. Marcus said, we're begging as Israelis for a solution for the Palestinians to take control over their own affairs. This is not true. And in fact, senior Israeli officials say the exact opposite. The current government that's in control says the exact opposite. They say, we have no time for these negotiations. It's a waste of our time. And our intentions, our direction are different. And so we have to listen to their own statement around their intent. I wanted to pick up on two things. One, this notion of anti-Semitism. I have to say, as an organization that prizes human rights, we are devoted to combating all forms of discrimination, including anti-Semitism. We work on this issue around the world, and it in fact is an issue that is of great concern to us. That said, and I think it's important to note that the citations that were made about religious figures making statements on Palestinians TV, we have to consider the context. You have annually in Israel, a march where ultra-Orthodox young Jewish men march through the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, chanting death to Arabs, burn their land, get them out. And you know what Israeli authorities do to address this chant? It happens every year, and it's covered publicly in the news. In fact, most recently, at the end of May, we had thousands of Israeli nationalists chanting death through Arabs, going through the old city of Jerusalem. And the Israeli authorities' solution is, okay, let's move the Palestinians out of the area for that period of time to allow this procession to come through. So this sense of authorities who are not reining in the most fringe, ultra-right, ultra-Orthodox elements of their society. I think this is an issue in both parts in the Palestinian authorities' case and among Israeli authorities. And I think that is the kind of step that we would expect a government to take to try to address. And I would say the same for the Palestinian Authority. And that brings me to my last point, which is, as a human rights organization, we have an extensive track record of documenting violations and abuses committed by the Palestinian Authority itself. We made a submission, for example, to the UN Commission Against Torture, particularly about impunity of PA operatives in their detention, in their arbitrary arrests, and even what we've characterized as torture, both by Hamas and the PA. So we have, as a human rights organization, an equal opportunity, neutral observer approach here. We're not afraid to criticize the Palestinian Authority when they violate the rights of their people. And in fact, we do so directly to them. We do so in the media, and we do so at the United Nations. But we're going to take the same approach to Israel. There is no reason not to apply the same law, public international law, to a government and see if it meets the standard and the threshold. And that brings me to this last point, which is, the notion of security justifications, the reference to terrorist attacks. I think preventing and countering terrorism is a very legitimate security goal of any government. It's certainly a goal of the US government, where I'm living in New York. It's a goal of the Indian government, but how you do it is critical. Governments have an obligation both to their citizens, to protect them, to give them security, but also not to do so in a way that violates their rights, and to do so in a way that violates the rights of these millions of Palestinians who remain occupied. So the notion that you can justify almost anything because there have been a period of terrorist attacks, I would be really worried about that. We need to look specifically at each incident and see, is it proportional? Is it appropriate? Does it match the circumstance? And as the world saw with the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian journalist, someone who was working for Al Jazeera, these security justifications can also be flimsy. The story that we've heard from Israeli security services about Ms. Akleh's killing has changed 4 or 5 times. We haven't gotten to the bottom of it. And I think the immediate assertion that, it was terrorists who were there and that was why we had to do it, that's all fallen away as a fig leaf. So we really need to be rigorous when we consider these assertions of terrorism.
Right. Thank you, Ms. Kumar. Let me bring in Abhijit Iyer Mitra. Abhijit, Itamar Marcus talks about the Israeli intent, and that's what I want to discuss more specifically. When you look, and you can almost compartmentalize it into two time periods: pre-2017 and post-2017, before Donald Trump entered office. And before, what we see normally is that before 2017, Israel had overtly conciliatory tone, although its actions would have been otherwise. But post 2017, what we see is that it's a lot more aggressive in its approach. In fact, to the point that a former prime minister goes on to say that Palestinians would not be allowed to be citizens of Israel, nor will they be allowed to form their own state. Where does that leave the Palestinians, Avijita, and how are you reading the tea leaves going forward?
So, that particular thing that Palestinians will never be citizens of Israel has been policy for a very long time. It didn't change in 2017. See, just making a public statement to that effect doesn't mean that it is public policy. Also, let's be clear that both the West Bank and Gaza are under an occupation. It's just that their respective governments treat their own citizens far worse than the Israelis ever would. I've literally seen a Palestinian boy outside where we were staying at this Movenpick Hotel being bashed up by security forces and taken out in front of us because apparently he was passing on information to Israeli police or something like that. And we found out later that he'd been executed. But let's be clear, Palestinian crimes against their own people, and mind you, there are a lot of crimes that both the PLO and that happen both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and they're nasty. They're really, really nasty. This is one step. That doesn't in any way mean that they are not under an occupation. They are under an occupation. On the other hand, I think, again, we keep going back to the same issue where Aishwarya was again conflating. Remember, when I wanted to talk facts, she then wanted to talk human impact. And again, there was this conflation of somebody living in East Jerusalem, who is by their definition an Israeli citizen, an Israeli Arab, with somebody living in, Ramallah or Jenin, who is under an occupation.
No, they were married,
right?
though, Abhijit. So, they were married and kept apart simply because of that nuance that you're pointing out, the nuance. This is a couple. They're married, and just because of the audacity of falling in love, they're separated from their kids.
They are married and kept apart.
Emotion.
I can show you 100 different cases of the American embassy denying spouse visas in Delhi. My own cousin has not been able to get a visa for 8 years to join her husband, and now her husband has to come back. That doesn't make America an apartheid state. Right? So, unfortunately, that's not the way you classify apartheid. In this particular case, let's get back to the rules. The rules are different for Israeli Arabs, and the rules are different for Palestinians. And I can show you 100 different statements made by Palestinian leadership talking about demographically swamping Jews in Israel. And Israel has a right to protect its Jewish identity, on which basis it was created by the UN. So I'm sorry, that's not the way it works. I know it's not nice. Justice should be done for everyone. Sadly, rules tend to be like this. Second, I can show you several very nice Palestinians who very frequently have very strange terror connections. One of them was the Palestinian ambassador to Delhi, a man named Adli Sadek. Now, Adli Sadek in 2011, there was a horrible terror attack in Eilat, where 6 women and children were killed. And this was just a few days after or before, because this is quite long back, I forget, Gandhi Jayanti. And he had given, Adli Sadek had given a speech at the Indian Council for World Relations, saying, which is, the foreign ministry think tank, saying, Mahatma Gandhi's lesson of peace and non-violence is for everybody. And then we found the day after this Eilat terror attack happens, the Palestinian ambassador to India is glorifying those killers in Arabic newspapers saying that this was a quote unquote, a quality attack that would be impossible to replicate, but it is desirable to replicate it. Okay, I can tell you, I have had so many conversations with people who are not even Muslim. So for example, Hanan Ashrawi is not Muslim. I don't think Hussein Zomlot is a Muslim. But they will keep telling you about this entire demographically overwhelming Jews in their own land. So I'm sorry, this isn't a one-sided thing. Every country has the right to protect its national character. The Palestinians, it seems, simply don't want to create their own piece of land. They've been given several opportunities too. They just keep going back. No, tomorrow we'll get a better deal. Tomorrow we'll get a better deal. There was the Camp David meetings between Arafat and, was it Yitzhak Rabin or Shimon Peres? I forget who it was. They rejected it and they walked out. That was a final status settlement. Who walked out of there? It wasn't the Israelis who walked out of there. It was Yasser Arafat who walked out of there. Okay, so, it's very easy to pass off your own failures onto why are Palestinian children executed and tortured by their own police? Oh, the Israelis did it. They're so much worse. They're the Uyghurs. So, this entire boogeyman mentality, it doesn't work. I accept there's a human impact. There is not a single law that does not have a human impact. Okay, that isn't institutionalized racism. I'm sorry. Then I think there's another point to be made out here, which is, we really need to keep sticking, like I said, to the facts. We're going down on emotion. Families are separated all the time, everywhere in the world. All right. If I assume I have a boyfriend in America, we decide to get married. It's illegal in India. I land up in America without documentation. Where do you think I'm going to be? In an immigration lockup, and to be deported very soon. Australia has the Pacific solution. There are several Indians married to Pakistanis, Pakistani married to Indians, who will never be given a visa to come over. That doesn't make you an apartheid state. I'm sorry, but that's not the way this works. It's very easy to take, and again, we're not talking about rules. The moment we start talking about rules and we start categorizing them into what category it comes, we're automatically then transported to the emotional angle. I really don't want to discuss emotions out here. There are human tragedies to be found in every single law. But human tragedies don't define apartheid. There is a strict legal framework for apartheid. You can, cherry pick and change all these definitions as and when it suits you. Let me give you a simple example. France, going more and more laïcité on its Muslim population is apparently, according to New York Times, it is Islamophobic majoritarians. Okay. But Israel allowing its own Muslims to have their own laws is apparently a very bad thing. And then they'll quote the fact that, Jews can't marry Muslims in Israel. Guess what? The religious authorities control that. Each religion, they decide their own marriages. So what happens is my friend Mayuri, who lives in Tel Aviv, she got married, she lives in Jerusalem, sorry. She got married to her Israeli boyfriend. They went to Georgia and it got accepted. Why? Because she doesn't represent a fundamental threat to the democratic state of Israel. Again, let's keep going back to facts. I have huge issues when this goes down emotional, human impact angles and all of that. The law is the law. All laws have human impact, and they're not nice.
Let's go to that. When laws are not nice, that's the problem, right? When laws are discriminatory, when governments are not taking efforts to rein in the most extreme, the most right wing, that is a government failing its duty to its people.
Sorry,
and that's an ineffective security response. It's actually self-defeating as well. right? It's
No.
not setting
Look,
up us up for
Akshay,
peaceful resolution.
Akshay. Look, every country, I'm sorry to use this word, but every country has its share of assholes. Countries can't be defined by the assholes they produce. Okay, there are lots of Muslim suicide bombers. That doesn't make Muslims nasty characters. Israel has its fair share of assholes, just like India has its fair share of assholes. That doesn't make Israel an apartheid state. I would say freedom of speech is much better respected in Israel. I would say it actually follows a Brandenburg principle, which is it has to be a specific threat against a specific individual for it to qualify. That is what free speech is about. If tomorrow, you go around chanting, death to Israel in Israel, I have actually seen a protest in East Jerusalem where people were going around shouting death to Israel. They didn't get dispersed by Israeli police. Even though there were guards standing right there with guns.
I would like to
sorry, it just doesn't meet this criteria that we're making out of apartheid.
And I'm just worried
Israel
about the
I would just like to respond to this.
just one point, which is that people for even carrying the Palestinian flag.
Mr. Marcus, can we have Akshay respond, please? Yeah, Akshay, please respond.
I'm just worried about the anecdotes. Okay, I saw this happened. Let's look at rigorous documentation. Technically, it's legal to have the Palestinian flag in Israel, but police are arresting people. And we all saw the video. Miss Akla's funeral procession was interrupted because people were carrying the Palestinian flag. So even the flag itself, which is protected under Israeli law, Israeli police authorities are confiscating the flag. They are snatching it out of people's hands. So this notion of free speech, there's free speech to chant deaths to Arabs, but there's also a restriction enforced by police. We see this documented repeatedly, not just one-off instance, documented repeatedly, and not being enforced and protected by the courts. This is what I'm talking about, a government failure to rein in those who are at the extreme edges.
Again, in that particular protest, that was an unauthorized protest. They weren't stopped because of the flags in their hand.
I have to add to this a couple of things. There's so many inaccuracies, I'm sorry, in what Ms. Kumar is saying. So first of all, there's no such thing. Just recently, there was a demonstration at Tel Aviv University by Israeli Arabs at Tel Aviv University, and they were all holding the Palestinian flag, which got a lot of Israelis angry. But the rule was you're allowed to hold the Palestinian flag, and no one stopped them from holding the Palestinian flags. When I say inaccuracies, you have to understand so many things. Every society has a fringe, and there are a small fringe in Israel who will yell death to the Arabs. It was never thousands of people, as you described at a recent march. It was a few people. And I want to tell you something. How does Israel deal with this fringe? And this is the critical. A few years ago, there were some Israelis at a soccer match who yelled death to the Arabs. You know what? First of all, they were arrested. I saw a children's program on TV not long after that, where they had children sitting in the audience and they played the audio of that, and all the children in the audience condemned it. We should never say this. Every person has a right to life. So that when Israel sees something that's on the fringe that is bad, we do everything we can to eliminate it. So every society has fringe. Now, the statements that I made to you before, that I quoted, that you were comparing to, is not the fringe. And that's the tragedy. This is the mainstream of the Palestinian Authority. This is Mahmoud Abbas saying the Jews are so evil, they brought the Holocaust on themselves. This is an official on Palestinian TV, official Palestinian TV, saying exterminate the Jews. I want to give you another incredible statement that's shocking, coming from one of essentially the top religious figure in the Palestinian Authority. Top religious figure is Mahmoud al-Habash. He was appointed by Mahmoud Abbas to be his personal advisor on Islam, and he's head of the Sharia courts. Well, he went on Palestinian television and he said, what's the conflict about with Israel? He didn't use the word Israel. What's the conflict about? He says, he didn't say the conflict was about territory. He said it's a historic conflict fighting against evil, meaning Jews are evil, fighting against people who are allied with Satan, people who are allied with the devil. And then he summarized, the conflict here now is nothing new. This is Satan's project versus Allah's project. Now, this is not fringe. This is the top Palestinian Authority religious figure telling Palestinians that they are fighting against Israel because Jews are allied with Satan, and because of that, Israel is Satan's project. Now, again, you can't compare that to an individual kid yelling death to the Arabs. That's the problem. In Israel, it's the fringe, and we fight the fringe. In the Palestinian Authority, it tragically is the mainstream. And from the mainstream, from the leaders, it's going down to the people. It's going down to the people because these are their role models. These leaders are their role models, and that's the great tragedy of the Palestinian Authority. Now, talking about minorities in different countries, here you have, you're talking about oppressing people or apartheid. Take a look at one population in two different regions. Talk about the Christian population. Take a look at the Christian population in Israel and the Christian population in the Palestinian Authority. The Christian population in Israel is thriving. Churches growing. They're members of the society. They're members of the country. They've been in the Knesset. They've been in the Supreme Court. They're everywhere. Take a look at Bethlehem. When Israel ruled Bethlehem, the Christian population was around 70%. This is before 1993. Once the Palestinian Authority took over the land and it was ruled by the PA, life for Christians became so miserable. Today, there are some between 10 and 15% Christians in Bethlehem. All the others ran away, many to South America, others to Europe. They couldn't live. So if you're talking about a racist, oppressive regime against another people, against another religion, it is the Palestinian Authority. Not just they took away the democracy, they didn't make Christians, they didn't enable Christians to live and to thrive in their own country. Now, you mentioned a number of Israelis who are critical of Israel. I think it's wonderful that there are Israelis who are critical of Israel, because that's the proof of what a wonderful democracy that we have. Arabs of Israel can criticize Israel, Israeli former leaders can criticize Israel, Palestinian who criticize Mahmoud Abbas's government end up in jail. Nizar Banat, Palestinian who criticized the Palestinian Authority, was taken to the police department. He was arrested by police and he was murdered in the police station. Just over a year ago, and they still haven't been able to prosecute the policemen who were involved, of course, because this is what Palestinian Authority policy is. So the Palestinian Authority is oppressive to its own people. It's oppressive to Christians. And the more it's oppressive, the more it has to blame Israel. How does it blame Israel? By having people like Mahmoud Halabash go on TV and say, Israel is Satan's project. Israel's connected to Satan. Satan brings all the evil to the world that it needs. By the way, we've seen cartoons on Palestinian TV showing that Jews are connected with Satan as well. Cartoons for young children on Palestinian TV showing Satan hovering over Jews and giving them ideas how to attack Islam. So,
right.
So when
Mr.
you
Marcus,
have this kind of so this is the Palestinian Authority world. It's a world of hatred, not on the fringe. It's coming from the top and it's trickling down to the people. And you have a population that's hateful of Israel.
Right.
Can I
Mr.
just
Marcus?
quick point, Bhuvan? A very quick point.
Sure.
Akshay, just because I say it doesn't mean it's an anecdote and you say it that it's documented. I've actually documented everything I'm saying on my Twitter timeline with photographs. Okay, so I know this is a classic game that NGOs play, that your facts are anecdotes and my anecdotes are facts, but it is there on my Twitter timeline. Also, just remember the protest that Itamar spoke about. There were 3 people arrested, and they weren't arrested for flying the Palestinian flag. They were arrested for bashing up somebody, 2 of whom got released that same evening. And this was that protest in the middle of Tel Aviv University with Palestinian flags.
Right,
Okay?
Abhijit, we'll move on to Akshay. We'll let her respond. We'll let her respond.
Again, we need to be very factual with this.
Abhijit, we'll let Akshay respond.
Like I
one
said.
second. Akshay, can you just come in and respond to the points that are made by Mr. Marcus and Mr. Mitro? And I also want you to talk about what using such a term such as apartheid when you talk about Israel, what does it actually achieve? Because as a layman, what one gets the sense is that it is just leading to a hardening of stance on the Israeli side, and it's not drawing any particular reactions that would actually serve the Palestinian people on the ground. So could you just build on these 2 topics, please?
Let me begin with your second question because it's important. As an independent human rights group that works on issues around the world, for us, it's important to speak to facts as we find them and to characterize them to the law as it exists. In the case of Israeli authorities' responsibility for committing the crime of apartheid, it's important to identify crimes. And in this particular situation, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction over what is happening in the occupied Palestinian territories, and the Rome Statute, we started out this discussion with that reference to that document, the Rome Statute, includes the crime of apartheid. So it's very relevant for the purpose of justice and accountability for victims, that those of us who do documentation then match the facts with the law and draw conclusions. And at the end of the day, a court of law will be the one who will draw the final conclusion on these issues. It's not debates that will resolve it. But I think the broader issue here is that we need to be able to diagnose the situation as it is in order to be able to solve it. And whether we're talking about a situation of entrenched institutionalized discrimination, whether it rises to the level of the crime of apartheid, we can't have effective recommendations on solutions if we're caught up in the frameworks of the past. For example, this discussion, we veered back to Camp David. We've talked about assertions that the Palestinians could have their own state. But the current situation is that Israeli authorities are not willing to negotiate. None of these deals are on the table. So what we have is an unending occupation over 50 years, no clear end in sight. And I think we can't allow that fig leaf that this occupation is temporary, that there will be some kind of political solution in the future to justify interminable human rights violations in the present. It's simple to say, okay, well, there are, not nice fringes of all society, but what we have documented are state policies, our laws, the nation state law, the law around residency permits for people who marry across what they call the Green Line, the law on housing demolition, which means Israeli authorities systematically don't give permits for Palestinians to maybe improve their properties or even to have their properties, if you're talking about Bedouin in the Negev, and then bulldoze whole communities. And the Israeli Supreme Court is complicit in authorizing this. At this point, we've seen that with the most recent decisions. So you don't have the checks and balances that other systems have, where you have a judicial authority that oversees the executive and prevents excesses, where you have executive, where you have the law enforcement who are reining in the most extreme. The approach that's been taken, and I think it's admirable what was described by Mr. Marcus as, education for children, addressing radicalization. I think that is a goal and really a good approach to programming. But we have to look and say, okay, well, this is a great example, but what we're seeing overall writ large from Israeli senior officials doesn't match the spirit and intent of that type of a program. And I would hope that more Israeli officials would take that type of an approach to reconciliation, as opposed to the current approach, which is one of, I think, emboldened, complete, a sense that this is the moment to really finalize this domination. And the Trump administration was referred to. I think we can't ignore the enabling role that the US government has played in this, not just in providing weapons, but in also providing political cover, in not challenging the expansion of settlements. It's a well-known principle in international law that you shouldn't expand settlements, and Israeli authorities continue to announce the expansion of settlements. Historically, other governments and the United Nations have had a clear line against that. And starting with the Trump administration, we've seen that fall away. And I think that enabling environment makes it all the more important for those of us who are neutral observers. And I think, India's position in the non-aligned movement, that neutral entity really needs to address that as well.
But Ms. Kumar, the fear that the question of whether Israel and its leaders are guilty of racial and ethnic segregation, one fears it's being reduced to merely a talking point, a discussion point for political propaganda or public relations. How would you respond to those who say that? Ms. Kumar, can you hear me? Are you able to hear me?
Sorry, can you repeat?
The fear that the Israel and its leaders, they are guilty of racial and segregation, and the fear that it's just being reduced to merely a talking point, a discussion point in global discourse for political propaganda or even for public relations. That fear is coming true now, isn't it?
Well, I think honestly, we're not even seeing enough instances where people are confronting the facts of the situation here. And when neutral bodies, when the United Nations comes forward with its attempts to report, for example, the UN has authorized a commission of inquiry. And there on that, there's an Indian jurist, a very respected Indian jurist. He's been smeared for simply making some comments in the media. So what we see is there is a lot of politicization around the discourse. There's a lot of tone policing, and there's a lot of restrictions that make it hard for us to even have an open conversation about what's happening. But as a human rights organization, we would like to bring it back to the law. We like to bring it back to the elements of the crime. Here we find the inhumane acts. We find the denial of residency to thousands of Palestinians, the demolition of homes, the freeze on spouses and relatives being registered. And this is this is really distinguishable from someone seeking to immigrate to a different continent across the world. We're talking about people trying to travel a few kilometers, maybe to go back to their family home. And we have to really recognize that, of course, Israel has the right to extend citizenship offers to anyone who it chooses. And there is a legitimate reason for saying that Israel chooses to extend citizenship offers to Jewish Israelis, but that doesn't justify discrimination against the people who are already living there, against those who had family homes there, who are now effectively barred from traveling even the distance of kilometers, from cancer patients receiving treatment. We see this often. Cancer patients need advocacy from NGOs in order to be able to move out of Gaza to even get treatment. So these restrictions on free movement, on ownership of land, and the approach of Israeli authorities there is quite relevant. It's not just fringe elements of society. When you have authorities who are the ones who are not permitting people to move or own land or renovate their homes or even work.
I just want to make a comment. You're commenting, first of all, about the no freedom of movement, as if Israel is trapping Palestinians. Do you know that in the last year alone, 250,000 residents of Gaza went into Israel when they had to for various things, both for work as well as for hospital care. And these are UN statistics. These are UN statistics. So to say that there's no freedom, and this is in spite of the fact that Gaza regularly, Hamas in Gaza and the Islamic Jihad are regularly lobbing thousands and thousands of missiles upon Israel. And yet 250,000 came into Israel to work and to go to hospitals. So again, you're giving out cliches that aren't based on facts, and I'm sorry because it really distorts the conversation. But I want to say something else. You said that in the past, Israel was willing. You're acknowledging that Israel was willing and offered the Palestinian Authority state a number of times, very generously, I would say, and that now the people are less willing. So I want to give you 3 reasons why Israelis who once were very happy to offer the Palestinian Authority a lot that is basically close to the green line, today they don't. And I want to talk about 3 things very, very briefly. The first one is the problem of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and terror. Not only haven't they distanced themselves from terror, but the Palestinian Authority actively rewards terror. And by the way, they incentivize terror. You know, we're comparing, you're trying to compare Israel to South Africa. I don't think in South Africa they didn't give financial rewards to a policeman who might have killed a black person. In the Palestinian Authority, there are massive financial rewards. I just want to show you a chart that we produced here at Palestinian Media Watch. If you can see this, I hope you can a little bit. What you see here is
Itamar, just bring it closer to the camera.
Closer to the camera.
It blurs it for you. Yeah. Yeah, that background's problematic. It's blurring automatically.
Yeah.
See, it's a background blur. You've got some background blur on it, Itamar.
Background blur.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay,
Yeah.
what you have here, just I'll show you. You have a picture of 2 parents and their 3 children, aged 11, 4, and 3 months, Now, they were killed in their homes. The 3 children were in their bed. The parents were killed in the home. They were killed by Ajman and Hakim Awad. Now, they were literally, people who saw the pictures, and I saw some of them with the blood all over the wall, the kids' throats were slit while they were in the bed. The Palestinian Authority has rewarded them financially $267,000 since they did this. The Palestinian Authority has a law that every Palestinian who goes to jail for what they call, what we call a nationalistic crime, gets financial reward in prison. It's much, much more than the average Palestinian Authority salary. They'll end up getting 12,000 shekel a month if they're in jail long enough. 12,000 shekel, that's four times the average Palestinian Authority salary, 400%. So this is the Palestinian, they reward terror. I'll give you one more example. Abdallah Barghouti, I don't know if you can see all these faces here. All these children and adults who were killed by Abdallah Barghouti. He was a Hamas suicide bomb builder. He built bombs that killed 67 people. He's sitting 67 life sentences. He's already gotten from the Palestinian Authority $320,000 in payment, in monthly salaries for being a murderer. Now, there are 4,500 prisoners. They are all in jail now. They're all getting salary. There are another 7,000 released prisoners who were in jail more than 5 years. They continue to get salary for lifetime. How are we Israelis supposed to trust the Palestinian Authority when they are literally rewarding and incentivizing terror? That's the first thing. The second thing, the Palestinians don't tell their people that they want a two-state solution. The Palestinian Authority literally tells their people that the goal is to get Israel to something close to the green line. And then once they're close, the demise of Israel is going to be very easy. I'll give you an example from a poster that was in a Palestinian Authority Ministry of Education website a few months ago. It had a picture of all of Israel and the Palestinian Authority territories, and it said, Palestine is all ours from the river to the sea. All of Israel, Ministry of Education. We have dozens and dozens and dozens. Actually, we have hundreds of examples like this that the Palestinian Authority is
Mr. Marcus, I understand. Yeah, we have a consideration of time, but I get the point that you're making, and so can we have concluding remarks?
This is why Israel cannot trust Palestinian Authority, because they're giving different messages to the world and Human Rights Watch than they're giving to their own people. We see those messages, and it's horrific.
Right. As I said, we are moving into the final few minutes of our discussion. So I'd like all three of you to give your concluding remarks as to what do you think is the way going forward. And very briefly at that, 90-second stops. We'll begin with Abhijit Mitra.
So yes, Akshay is right that it's an unending occupation. The thing is, occupations end when both sides reach agreement. The occupation was there for a reason, because they went on attacking Israel. Okay. To just throw up and get out like they did in Gaza, only to get attacked by Hamas over and over and over again, which wants to kill off all Jews, that is not a political settlement. So I think we also need to look at, it's very easy to use these terms like unending occupation, but we also need to understand that there is a right of self-defense. There is a right of, there is a duty for the other state to not allow its territory to be attacked by another state, like Pakistan allows, terrorists to attack India. Second, I've read the Human Rights Watch reports, all of them on Israel mostly. Akshay was going to great lengths to say that this is established. I'm sorry, it is not established. I found that almost 90% of what I read in those things were either deliberately decontextualized or mistakenly decontextualized, I don't know, but they were decontextualized. There were too many stretches of logic. And finally, there was this point made about the right of return. I'm sorry, but there is no right of return. When you have population exchanges like India, Pakistan, like India, Bangladesh, like Turkey, Greece, etc., there is no recognized right of return. So we can make it up as we go along, but I'm sorry, that doesn't cut the ice.
Right. Can we have Itamar Marcus very briefly, sir?
Thank you. The final thing that I want to say is, why is Israel so concerned about even being more forthcoming to the Palestinian Authority? And the answer is very much connected to what you even just mentioned a moment ago. We gave away Gaza to the Palestinian Authority. And what did we receive? We received close to 20,000 missiles and rockets. Now, they're coming in the south. Very near Gaza is the desert, mostly unoccupied. Were we to give the West Bank and have 16,000 bombs and missiles falling on Tel Aviv and all our cities, we wouldn't have had a few hundred people murdered. We would have had thousands and thousands of people murdered. And we know from all the polls, Hamas is more popular in the West Bank. Hamas will win the next election in the West Bank. We will be ruled by Hamas. The West Bank will be ruled by Hamas. Will they be different in the West Bank? Of course not. So you expect Israelis to go and hand over the West Bank, like we did in Gaza, to a Hamas state, which will bring 20,000 bombs and missiles on Tel Aviv and Haifa and our entire population centers. It's not possible. It's not going to happen. We need to see a real change in the Palestinian Authority, a real change, a change in their education. Stop paying salaries to terrorists. Stop rewarding terrorists. Stop naming schools and streets after terrorists. When we see a change in the Palestinian Authority, Israel will be very, very forthcoming. We don't want to rule anyone. We want you to rule. We want them to rule their own lives, but we don't want bombs landing on Tel Aviv like we've got from Gaza.
Ms. Kumar, what would be the way going forward? Because many would argue that the two-state solution is a concept that is fast fading into oblivion. So how do you read the tea leaves, especially vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine?
I think the only way to look forward is to look with clear, unvarnished glasses as what is taking place in the current. And that means that we don't justify or rationalize institutionalized discrimination and systematic oppression on the basis that at some point in the future, things could get better, or that some political entity hasn't come to the table with the right attitude. We need to look at individuals whose rights are being abused, at individuals who are committing crimes. And I think that's actually the beauty of the law, right? A lot of this discussion has been Israelis versus Palestinians. We're speaking with broad swaths about groups of people, but what the law provides is a vehicle to say there's an individual perpetrator and an individual victim. Not all Israelis are guilty, absolutely not. But there are some Israeli authorities, individuals, who are responsible for this crime of apartheid. Not all Palestinians are terrorists. I think Abhijit made this point very eloquently earlier, that we can't speak of people as groups and swaths. The law provides us a rubric going forward, and the law provides us a way to assess the conduct of Israeli authorities as they manage the security situation, to see, are they living up to the ways and standards that the international community has set for dealing with such situations. And what our research has found systematically over many years, including our report of last year on apartheid, is that Israeli authorities are committing crimes, particularly the crime of apartheid and the crime of persecution. These are serious international crimes, and they deserve the attention of the world. We can't simply excuse them because there's a political process, or there isn't a political process, or there are problematic other actors. And I think we also need to hold the Palestinian Authority to account for the torture, which we've made submissions about to the UN, to account for the detentions. But in doing so, we don't justify and excuse. What we do is we look at each authority and their responsibilities, their obligations, and their violations. And in this case, we just published as Human Rights Watch a piece on a Palestinian French rights worker who's been detained without trial by Israeli authorities, whose status as a Jerusalemite is under revocation because of an alleged breach of loyalty, simply because of his work on issues like this, human rights work, on being a human rights worker. He's spent time in a poorly ventilated metal cage in central Israel. He is joined by hundreds of other detainees. And I think this holding people without evidence, without trial, it points to this broader problem of an impunity. And for me, addressing this impunity is the key to moving forward.
Thank you, Ms. Kumar. And that's our program, ladies and gentlemen. No one really knows where the Israel-Palestine conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestine Authority collapses. One can only speculate. But what we can all agree upon is that things, as of now, can't last much longer. The current situation is just not sustainable, and unless something dramatic changes, whatever happens next may be much, much worse. Abhijit Iyer Mitra, Tamar Marcus, Ms. Akshay Kumar, thank you so much for joining us at Argumentative Indians in what has been a most charged discussion. I'm sure our viewers enjoyed it. And for those of you who are just watching us on YouTube, Argumentative Indians is India's fastest growing thought platform, founded by Yajur Arora and Mayank Kalra. And I'm Bhuvan Apurva Jha. You can follow me on Twitter at Bhuvan_Apurv. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Argumentative Indians so you can hear about the newest presentations. You can subscribe to our official YouTube channel or go to our website www.argumentativeindians.com. If you have already subscribed, please do leave us a review. And if you do want us to give us some feedback, do reach out to us. Our official email is in the description box below. Thank you so much once again, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Abhijit Iyer Mitra, Itamar Marcus, Akshay Kumar, thank you so much once again for joining us on Argumentative Indians. It's a wrap. Good night.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.